Hi, I am Chester Moore, and I am a wildlife journalist. I make my living doing media work, writing, photography, podcast, radio, TV appearances, lectures on wildlife, fishing, and hunting. And I've also had a deep interest in the Bigfoot phenomenon and pretty much most of cryptozoology since I was a little kid. And one of the things I think is important for people who want to get into a legitimate form of field research is understanding native wildlife. If you don't know what's really out there, what was confirmed to be out there, scientifically recognized to be out there, you'll never be able to differentiate between what you experience with something that maybe is not verified but's out there. And I think a big part of this is vocalizations. And since we've never actually proven a Bigfoot and we've never sat a Bigfoot down and made him do vocalizations, so what we have to go by are sounds that have sort of stood the test of time and sounds that researchers throughout the last, 5-6 decades have sort of heard almost universally in the Bigfoot world out there and stand out from accepted wildlife. And one of them is what I call the primate scream, and it was investigated by Texas A&M researchers for the original Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, one of the greatest films of all time done on Bigfoot. And to me, it sounds like a gibbon, which is a primate from Asia. And it has this long, drawn out, piercing sound. And there are some things that sound similar to that out there, but it's the presence and it's the volume that really kind of separates this from sort of some other sounds out there. And the interesting thing when they were analyzing that, they talked about it could have been potentially made from a human frequency, but not other animals, of known animals in the region it was recorded in. The Ohio howl is probably the most famous alleged Bigfoot call. And the only way I can say this is it almost sounds like you would picture a werewolf. There's something sounding like an old Universal movie. The thing you would immediately go to in terms of, a normal animal, quote unquote, would be a wolf or some kind of a dog, because it has that howling sound. But it is much deeper. It is much more long and drawn out and just pierces. And that's the thing I think we're going to keep going back to. These alleged Bigfoot calls sort of pierce the forest. They pierce the silence and darkness in a way that maybe other stuff doesn't. And if you listen to that Ohio sound, there is it's like it's almost regurgitating if you listen as it calls, thing going on. And when I've been around wolves a lot, gray wolves a lot in captivity, and heard them in the wild as well, and that's not what a wolf or a dog sounds like as it's doing it. So that's just something little thing that I picked up. The Sierra sounds recorded by Ron Moorhead and Al Berry are extremely interesting. People immediately jump out what's called a samurai chatter, which sounds like a person out there just chattering in some language. But there is another sound. I'll do a little snippet of it. A real guttural, deep, almost vomiting type sound that's in there. It's very, very intense. And a number of people have recorded hearing things in this tone. And the thing about this is the only thing that even reaches, in my opinion, anything remotely similar would be howler monkeys. Howler monkeys have some really intense vocal cords with that kind of rough, gruff, howl, yell things. And there's little snippets of that. There's nothing exactly like it in the Sierra sound, but there's snippets of that tone that I've heard nowhere else in nature. And It's a really interesting thing because I would say what's heard in the Sierra Sound is certainly not universally heard among people who do research, but people all around North America have reported hearing either sounds within it or something very, very similar. And a number of people I have spoken with have heard that real guttural, weird, similar sounds out there in the forest. And of course, it's always at night, usually super, super late at night, and it's always scary. And that's one of the things you kind of have to go back, familiarize yourself with local native wildlife, and then be able to go, now we have all these resources, just go on YouTube and start listening to sounds of animals. There are a lot of vocalizations of animals that sound really strange unless you've ever experienced them. And one of them that really jumps out at me now is the elk. Elk have some pretty intense and crazy sounding vocalizations. I spent a lot of time around elk in Colorado in particular, but also in Montana, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And that's one of the things people don't realize, especially people in the East and the South. Thank God there are returning elk populations due to scientific management of elk through the North American Model Wildlife Conservation in Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Arkansas, a bunch of other areas. If you've never heard an elk with that deep, crazy bugle that goes into that high-pitched thing, and you're in your tent at night in the elk rut in September or October, and a bull comes blasting behind your tent, you might think it's a Sasquatch. So an elk is a very important thing to understand the elk in this equation. Feral hogs are another. Feral hog populations are expanding. They're not only in the South. There are feral hogs in New York and New Jersey. There are feral hogs in Canada, parts of Canada filtering into Montana. There are feral hogs in California and Oregon and some of these states as well. And hogs make some wicked sounds and a wide variety of sounds. I wrote a book called Hog Wild, and I'm really deeply into feral hogs. And one of the stories in the book is me being on a stand at night, because in Texas you can hunt hogs at night, and hearing this crazy demonic sound coming through the brush, and it sounded like an invading army, and it was just hogs full on going crazy, making all these crazy grunts and screams and whistles coming through the woods toward feed. And if you didn't know what you were listening to, you might think it's a Sasquatch. As a matter of fact, there's a YouTube video that has a lot more views than it probably should in Florida talking about a Sasquatch vocalization. And there are times in the wild where I've probably been fooled a couple of times. Another is owls. I've heard people talk about thinking they heard monkeys that were like the typical, I think when we said we heard a monkey sound, there's like a typical sound we all think that maybe like on the old Tarzan movies or whatever, you know, you hear this monkey sound, like monkey chatter. And the barred owl does a very monkey-esque sound in part of its vocalization. They're a very vocal animal. They also do some screeches. You have the screech owl. And I do believe with potential Sasquatch vocalizations, there are some blurred lines of sounds that are very similar to owls. But you need to understand owl vocalizations. And here's the thing, owls are everywhere. Anywhere you're going to encounter a potential Sasquatch investigation, you're going to have owls in the area. So you definitely want to be able to learn to eliminate that. You might scare yourself halfway to death, or maybe embarrass yourself and put out a video that this was absolutely a Sasquatch, and it's like not even one of those blurred lines at a distant sound. It's one of those obvious sounds. And another one is coyotes. Once again, they're everywhere. And coyotes can make some terrifying sounds. I'll never forget being in Newton County, Texas, letting out a coyote yell just to see if any coyotes would respond at night. And I think the entire woods was lined with coyotes that night. And they let out some spooky, crazy sounds that are between a yip and a howl, and something they growl. And that's one, especially when they're like down in a creek bottom, because a lot of times these creek bottoms and canyons and things, you get kind of an echo effect going on. And it almost sounds like if you're a musician, like you put a flanger on your guitar, a little bit of delay or something. And it's really garbled, and it can be very mysterious type sound. I've had people message me that they thought they heard a Sasquatch behind their house. And it was, when I listened and I listened closely, it was coyotes at a distance. So we have many, many exotic animals. When I say exotic animals, I mean non-indigenous animals brought over to America for hunting purposes, for zoological purposes, for pets. And that really changes the dynamic of what we're experiencing out in the wild. One example, it doesn't even really get into sounds, was I had someone tell me about this location in central Texas where they had a Bigfoot investigation, and they were looking out with a thermal, and they saw this thing that had big ears, but it was bipedal, and it had really big, tall ears, and it was moving really strangely. It moved extremely fast through this area. And I said, have you ever considered a red kangaroo? And they went, uh-uh. And I said, well, there are a lot of red kangaroos in Texas, and sometimes they get out of their high-fenced abodes. And when they went back and thought about what they saw, they agreed that it probably saw a red kangaroo at night. So when it gets into vocalizations, I'm not even up, and I live in Texas and do a lot with exotic animals, all the vocals of these exotic deer and stuff. So for example, we have two very common exotic deer in Texas that are way beyond the bonds of them. These things escape high fences all the time, are the axis deer and there's the Sasquatch deer. And they have an elk-like bugle. I mean, they sound very much sort of elk-like, maybe not as intense, but elk-like. And the axis deer has a weird whistle type sound that they make. And you have to be able to differentiate some of these exotic animals that are out there doing, I mean, every animal has some kind of a vocalization. And you have to understand that at one point it was estimated there were 40 species of exotic ungulates in Texas alone, and they're spreading all over the place. I recently saw some game cam photos up in Oklahoma where there were cyca deer and things like that running beyond the bonds of high fence, a free-ranging population of aoudad. And so there's a lot of stuff out there. So you have to consider all of that if you want to be a complete researcher. So those are some animals that people definitely should study if they want to be a researcher that can compare native wildlife to, well, if they're real, they're native, but known wildlife, scientifically accepted versus the mysterious. So as people go out there and do research, it would be wise to listen, to record, to try to pick out things that stand out from whatever else is out there in nature, things that we know about, things that are accepted by science. And then when you have things that don't fit the mold, then you have to go, And one other thing I want to say, if you're going out to do your own Bigfoot research, don't advertise it. Don't let people know where you're going, because you might get human interference. You may hear a primate yell and it'd be a human doing it, right? So people can make some of these noises. But if you do your research right and you go in with stealth and don't advertise it on social media, and you're on some dark creek bottom at 4 a.m. at the tail end of you heading back toward camp or maybe back toward the vehicle, and then you hear this guttural, evil sounding growl, chances are it's not a canary. Chances are it's probably not an owl. It may go into the unknown. And then again, you may have encountered a Bigfoot. One way you can keep up with really interesting stuff is to keep following Wild Man of the Woods. Incredible work that Paul does on this. And I'm honored to get to do some narrations here and there. And you can go to my blog, globalbigfoot.com. I have a blog about this topic. I'm going to be doing more on the vocalization part because personally, I believe that studying vocalizations in this phenomenon is the most important thing we can do, practical. Because if you put a game camera out, it's always going to end up being a guy in a suit with somebody, no matter what, no matter how cool it is. Plus, maybe you have 50 feet, 75 feet. You put a recorder out in the woods, or you start recording, you might pick up something from a quarter mile away. So, and plus, we know verified sounds of various animals we can compare to. So I think it's a great way to do research. You can check out my blog on that at globalbigfoot.com, and also subscribe to Global Bigfoot, the YouTube channel, or I'll send Sasquatch to come visit you at night.